Hello again, Ryan.
Hey, Kelly. Thanks for
What's going
having me again.
Okay, everybody. Good evening, and thank every one of you for joining this session with Ryan. And today we will be talking about hidden history, chronology, and mud flood. Pretty interesting topic, actually. Something outside of what we've been conditioned in school to believe, because history, okay, the way we were taught is not what it is when you sit back and examine things from, a logical standpoint. So today we decided to touch on a few things. I expect this to be like a series because one thing I want for Rhea and I to do with this particular topic is to run it in an alphabetical order so people who are new to it could understand what it is that we're doing. So it doesn't matter if it's going to take us another 2 months to cover as much as possible topics and then get people exposed to this information. That would be fine. With that being said, let's go back to the formalities. Ryan, would you briefly introduce yourself to some of the people that are just new to you?
Yeah, well, most people would have heard of me or even seen me on the last, us together here in the last two lives talking about health and radiation. And I'm in those two businesses. So usually I have a bit of a formal introduction there. I've got some credentials, so to speak. But probably half of the uh, people that have me on their podcast and stuff like that, it's to talk about Mudflood or conspiracy stuff. But I don't really have credentials for that. I do read a lot of books. I've been reading voraciously for over 16 years, but a lot of this stuff is not in books. Like I didn't learn most of this from books. I've read a lot of regular history books. It didn't help me at all with this because history is written very certainly. Like this happened on this date with these people. Period. Just accept it. That's what the history books don't really question these things very thoroughly. And only recently I found some books that go into hidden history. And most conspiracy books are not very good, by the way, right? Sometimes people ask, hey, what's your favorite conspiracy books? I don't really have any, Conspiracy people aren't really good at writing books, and they aren't really good at laying their case out. And most of this is from YouTube, right? I've learned more on YouTube than anywhere else on this subject, but even then, you have to dig through so much nonsense to start getting things that make sense. And even there's a lot of great content creators that I love. They waste a lot of time though. It's taken years and years and years to really, parse some of this apart and get somewhat of a clear picture on this. But I've been into conspiracies, my whole life, basically back since like the moon landing and, Bigfoot and stuff like that, into the dark side of YouTube since there was a YouTube. I think that's 2005, so it's a long time now. But only recently, this hidden history stuff has really become a big topic in the truther community, we can call them. And it's sort of started with Mudflood, and now it's much more diversified. There's a lot more about the broader problems with the historical narrative. And probably for the introduction, I should just say that we all know now, or at least we should know, that the media lies very, very frankly. So what's happening right now is not what they show on the TV. A
True.
great example is this whole pandemic thing, but even better is just what's happened in my country of Canada. They had this big peaceful protest trying to get freedom back in our country, and the media displayed it like, it was a bunch of Nazi, racist, violent people, and it clearly was not. So hopefully a lot of people were able to see that, there's a direct opposite in what happens in the real world and what they show in the media. Now, if we think that it stops with today's news, then, we're very, very sadly mistaken. I say all news is fake news, and basically all history is fake history. I don't want to make it sound like literally nothing is true in history books. It's not the case. Some things are true, but very, very generally the way history is painted for us, especially in the textbooks that we're given in school, it's pretty much 100% incorrect. Or, it's at least misleading, very, very, very misleading. You know, the heroes they portray are not really the heroes, right? The real heroes are not talked about at all, or they're disappeared from history, and so on and so on. And like I said, I think that's a good introduction. And if you have an idea on where to start this, we can kick this off. I do understand that a lot of people are not exposed to this at all, so we can start light. And the main thing that anybody should realize is, again, whatever the media is showing, there's an agenda to it. They're not there to report the truth, and so you can expect that trend to go back into history, because the same, not the same exact individuals, but the same groups of people with the same ideologies, you can call them the controllers, you know, it has always been their agenda to control the information that we have and basically control our reality.
All right, Ryan. Thank you very much for that quick for that introduction. That was loaded actually. So I'm thinking, where do we start it from? Chronology, Mudflood, or hidden history? Hidden history. Where should we pick this from?
Well, Mudflood is hidden history,
True.
but I would say, you know what? Let's start with Uriah, UB News, UBTV, because
Okay.
he was pretty much the first one. Maybe 5 or 6 years ago, I saw him talking about the Middle Passage, bringing slaves over from Africa to America, and he was showing the math involved, and he was saying, look, this is not possible. It's not possible for this many people to have been transported in this amount of time, and to have this many people end up in the continent. And he was pointing out that, right, black people, red people, white people, all kinds of people were already in the Americas. So the story they gave us about there just being a bunch of red-skinned Indians in the Americas is just not true. It was a major, major untruth. And that goes into Mudflood as well. When we start looking at the type of infrastructure that was already here in America, that they say we showed up and we just started building it. It's not true. It's not true. It was already here. And the people that were already here is the old world civilization that built that stuff. And they built that stuff all over the world. So when he showed that they could lie about something as big and significant as the Middle Passage and the whole, you know, history of slavery, basically, slavery did exist, I'm sure, but not in the way that they painted it. And when he showed that was, you know, a falsehood, it really, really opened up a whole lot more. Because if you don't accept that the whole story of Columbus and whatever, we came here and we just built the Americas, if you don't accept that, that opens you up to a lot more questions.
Sure. Okay. For those of you who don't know who Uriah is, Uriah has been my friend for like 4 years. Okay, he's one of those people who actually opened my mind up to so much questioning around things, and it's been very, very useful for me in how I formulate my thinking and my learning. I came up very slowly, paying attention, being very open, but Uriah played a very big role, and he's someone that I've tried so much to introduce to my people. Then, you know, I said to you in the DM, I said, why I do what I do is because I'm trying as much as possible to get my people exposed to this information. Because to a large extent, when I look around my people, we usually not, what I mean by my people, I'm from Nigeria, at least today. Okay, in today's terminology, I'm from Nigeria. So when I look around my people and the conversations I have with them and where their mind is at, they are very, very far removed from this information. I could say to you that things that we're going to discuss here is going to be new to about 95% of my people. 95%. And that is me being nice. I could say
Yeah.
90. This would be totally new information to about 98% of my own people. So what I do is just to, I could speak to you, I could do my own thing and be fine. But the beauty of information is to make sure that more people are exposed to it. So, with that being said, I've tried as much as possible to get my people exposed to Uriah, but I don't know. So maybe, hopefully, there would be changes. With that being said, let's get into it.
Sometimes we just got to give them the information themselves. You know, it's a very low conversion. You post a link, a few people will click the link, but
Mhm.
really, it's often most effective just to communicate the information yourself. In the
Yeah.
health business, right? All that health talk that we did, I could have simply just said, go watch Dr. Wallach lectures.
Sure.
We've got to skip the middleman sometimes and just deliver the information ourselves.
Right. So I'm going to start with something very, very touchy, a little bit controversial. I'll start from here. What is the role of the Bible in history? I know you are not expecting that, so go ahead.
I'm definitely not expecting that. Let me just say something really quick first, too. You said, you want to enlighten your people.
Mm-hmm.
Honestly, it doesn't matter who you are or where you are in the world. It doesn't serve any of us to believe the history that we've been given by the controllers, right?
Mm-hmm.
So whether you're white or black or any race, anywhere in the world, the history that we have been given for your people, our people, whoever's people it is, world people, it is there to entrap us and enslave us. It is there to prevent us from seeing the truth of this world. And I believe the reason for that is because if we knew the truth, we would know that we have the power. So there's a lot to that. But just saying that, even if your history is like good, say you're a European and like you're the winner sort of thing, it still doesn't serve you to believe in that history, right? You're
Mm-hmm.
still entrapped in the system of thinking that they've given you, and we need to break free of that if we're ever going to actually take control of our world, which we probably had at one point. The controllers probably weren't always in control. We like to think that these people have been running things forever. I don't think so. So you mentioned the Bible. This is a good place to pick off from the Bible. Well, they make it sound like the Bible was written 2,000 years ago, talking about the Old and New Testament. They make it sound like it was written 2,000 years ago by some, and after Jesus' death was the New Testament. Even they admit that, but they put it like 70 years after and then a few hundred years after, but it was still like 2,000 years ago. And they use these old authority figures, like Thomas Aquinas and these types of things, but the problem is we don't have the original manuscripts. And most of the manuscripts that we have for anything in history, including the Bibles, come from the Renaissance. They come mostly from the 16th, 17th century, sometimes as far back as the 14th century, but it's pretty dubious back there. And we have to just take their word for it when they say, oh yeah, those copies in the Renaissance, they were from an earlier copy, don't worry about that. We have to take their word from that because all of the original documents were destroyed. Maybe they were destroyed. It's a long time ago. Paper hasn't been around that long. These things are written on bark sometimes and papyrus, and they're not expected to survive that long. But nonetheless, we still have to take their word that these documents existed in their original form. And there's just so many problems with it. In the Old Testament is written in Hebrew, and the Old Hebrew wasn't even written with vowels. It's just consonants.
Yes.
So it's a massive problem. It's a massive problem when you don't have vowels, and the many old Egyptian scripts are written without vowels as well too. So a lot of the names of the kings that we think, we just made them up basically because we don't have their actual names. We have their consonants. Even worse, in a lot of the old Hebrew text, I don't speak Hebrew, by the way. Most of this is from Fomenko, Anatoly Fomenko, who's by far the most researched person, I think. He's still alive. And I don't think anyone's done more research on hidden history. He's been writing books about hidden history for over 40 years now. So I trust him, basically. And, he's showing a lot of these old Hebrew texts. Not only are they just strings of consonants, they don't have any punctuation marks or anything to even show you where a vowel would be. So you just have to guess. Is there a vowel there? Is there two vowels there? Three? Who knows? And in the worst cases, there isn't even spaces between the words. So we have to just guess, is this string of consonants a word? Is this a word? And so when we hear all these problems with translations, usually this isn't even mentioned. Usually we're like, oh, the old Hebrew word for this could actually mean this. But we don't even know if that was the original Hebrew word, right? It was a string of consonants, and it was written in a line of consonants, which is, it might as well be code. It's more than just translation. It has to be deciphered and guessed largely. You have to guess. Scholars at some point had to guess, and so even if the people who who translated, so to speak, these documents, even if they had good intentions, which I don't think they did, even if they had good intentions, it was a guess. So whatever their worldview was going to be translated into their translation. Since they had to use their existing knowledge of the world to make sense of these documents, we can expect there to be massive flaws no matter what. And that's just the old text. That's just the Old Testament. Sorry. So, was your question when, or how far does it go back, or what is the influence of these books?
Understand, because the role of the Bible in history and shaping history, because when you look at the way the Bible is set up, you can basically trace the existence of human history to the Bible. Like, looking at the lineages and whatnot, and then seeing how the names that you found in the Bible are found in different places and whatnot. Okay? And yes, you were right, the Bible was written the old in Hebrew language, that is without vowels, just consonant. And this same thing we find in Arabic. One single Arabic word could mean several things, depending on where you add the diacritic marks on it to give it different interpretation, right? And these are some of the problems too when interpreting the Quranic manuscripts and whatnot. And same thing, I think, basically, I think it's the same thing in all of history. I was also looking into the last time into the Rosetta Stone that was found in Egypt and the translation of the Rosetta Stone. And it's funny because they have to depend on some Coptic Christians to give them clues and then whatnot. So I agree with you on that. But I was just simply asking if the Bible played any significant role in how we understand history today. That's what I was basically asking.
Well, let's jump in. Let's jump in. Okay,
So
so the
go ahead.
Bible. If put Judaism aside for a minute, because the way that I see it, the main religion of the conquerors has always been Catholicism. Catholicism is basically another word, in my opinion, for Roman. Now, there's a word on here that people don't like to use, and YouTube, they think it's going to get them banned or whatever. Jesuit. So Roman, Catholic, Jesuit, they're basically all the same thing. And so most of our history is given to us by the Catholics, by the Romans. And this goes to Columbus and everything. These were Catholic people serving Catholic countries, Catholic kings, popes, and so on. These are the controllers, in my opinion. When we're talking about the old world, people call it Tartaria. Tartaria is Tartar is really just a word for a soldier. So the Tartarian Empire is not necessarily, it's probably not the actual word for it. It's probably more just of a conglomeration of nations, and Tartaria and Chinese Tartaria and Grand Tartary, these were different countries, within this conglomeration. But those were opposed to Romans. And the Roman takeover is what we live in now. I believe we do live in the Roman Empire now. And so it's been the Romans who have written our history. When we say that the history was largely written in the Renaissance, it was pretty much just written by Catholic Jesuits, right? Even Knights Templar, all these different groups of people, Masons, they're essentially Catholics. At least their history goes back to Catholics. So what role did the Bible play? The Bible played, the role of being the thing that you're supposed to believe given to you by the controllers, the Catholic controllers. And it wasn't until much more recently in history that anybody even questioned that, or at least publicly. We're talking about Martin Luther and the Reformation. Protestantism wanted to split away from Catholicism. Protestantism wanted to emphasize the individual's role in spirituality rather than the Catholic control system. Basically, that's what they were against back then, saying, hey, we don't need to take all of our spiritual advice and our spiritual history verbatim from these controllers, and we don't have to give all our tax money to the church and all this type of thing. Support your local church instead of supporting the head honchos in Rome and all this stuff. So the Bible very much played a huge role in controlling people, especially before they had access to other information. For the most part, it seems that the way that we viewed the world, the way that people viewed the world, was very much what was given to us in the Bible. So it's a problem. It's a problem if the Bible was translated and promulgated by people who were in control then and are in control now. It takes an enormous leap of faith, in my opinion, to believe that anybody in control has our interests in heart, especially when you're talking about popes and kings and everything like this. Like, for example, the police and the army, people think they're there to protect and serve the public. I mean, it's not true. Even in mainstream history, the police and armies were there to protect the king's peace, right? And who were the kings? The kings were representatives of the Catholic Church for the most part. So the people who enforce the rules that are put upon us literally are there to work for the controllers. And this was always out in the open until very recently, when they started to say, no, don't worry, the government and the police and all this, they're here for you. It's a huge trick. So once people got away from the Bible, they still had to control us somehow. And so this is why they've largely introduced certain scientific concepts, put scientific in quotes there, and I think it's an ongoing struggle that they have to continue to control the narrative. And, whatever trends that people come up with, they're going to try and infiltrate it to be able to control that as well. I guess I'm going a little bit off topic here, but there's no doubt that the Bible absolutely supported the power systems of the day, of the Renaissance and pre-Renaissance even. I don't think too much before that. And those same people are still in charge today. I guess I'm going to hand it back to you, but on the science thing, it's interesting to note that the Catholic Church and the Pope specifically, as science has gained more and more popularity, I'm talking about the Newtonian version of the world, basically, as it's gained more and more popularity, they've conceded a lot of their points. They don't seem to care to stick too tightly to what the Bible says. They seem to care much more in maintaining control over people's minds, in the sense that if people believe in science, the church now says, okay, we accept evolution. Nah, don't worry about all that other stuff we said for 600 years. We're cool with evolution now. The church is even now basically accepting the Big Bang Theory, which I think is complete nonsense. And I've made a video on that, the problem with the Big Bang Theory, by the way. I think it's one of the best videos I ever made, because I know by reading space books that they don't have much to that. They got 2 points propping up that whole thing. And so for an organization that claims to know the truth or even care about the truth, they're awfully willing to concede basically anything. As long as the public is now believing something new, the church will be like, okay, we believe that too. Just to sort of maintain control, I believe.
All right. Okay. Interesting. We will then touch on something before we get into chronology and whatnot. The question then is, there's this theory that says the library of Alexander the Great was burnt down and manuscripts were stolen and then hidden in Vatican and whatnot. My question then is, do you think, two questions. Do you think the library of Alexander the Great existed? And then do you think when we go into Vatican vaults or whatever it is called today, that we would find ancient documents? Okay. Do you think there is any such thing as Vatican vaults where we would find ancient documents?
Well, the second question, I think definitely there's stuff in the Vatican Library for sure that would probably blow our minds. That would probably put a lot of the questions that we have to rest. They most certainly know more than they tell. And I don't trust these people at all, by the way. And I'm not religious at all, by the way. So I don't know. This topic can be touchy for some people, but I don't know. I have no emotional connection to this. But definitely, we have no idea what's in the Vatican Library. I do believe it's one of the biggest, if not the biggest, library on earth. Would we find old documents? We'll probably find older documents than anywhere else that are probably real. I assume that a lot of these things, that tablets and you mentioned the Rosetta Stone. I imagine that a lot of these are planted. I imagine a lot of these are fake and they're there to mislead us. And probably what's in the Vatican is more so the truth. They probably have real documents showing the truth. Now, what was the Library of Alexandria? I don't know. I definitely do not believe that Alexander the Great was a ancient figure. You know, Fomenko believes, and I agree, that basically the ancient world, the world of antiquity, didn't exist. It's a phantom projection of the events that happened much more recently. Let's explain this. When it comes to many, many, many events and people in history, there seems to be many duplicates of them. And this is not just by observation. Anatoly Fomenko is a mathematician, so he would, in the time that he came up with this, he tried to figure out how to measure this scientifically. How can we quantify these sorts of things? So he would assign values to events in history, numerical values, and he would plot those values along a graph, and he would look for similarities. So if a bunch of events happened in this time, and then there's a similar pattern there at 400 years earlier, 1,000 years earlier, he calls those phantom duplicates. And some of the clues here are in the names themselves. You know, in the case of Alexander, Alexander the Great is obviously a title. You know, these people were probably not named these names when they grew up. Philip of Macedon Philip of Macedon was Alexander's father, supposedly. It basically just means a horse warrior, a mounted warrior. You know, he was a horse-loving person. Well, you're not named a horse-loving person when you're born. That's a title that you're given later in life. You know, just like Aristotle. Aristotle basically means scholar. So you wouldn't be given the name scholar as you're born. That's a title that you would inherit. And so these are probably clues that these names of these people, most of the significant figures of history, especially deep history, are titles that were come up with much, much later. And the real people that they're based on are usually closer to us in history, is what Fomenko believes, that the real one is usually the closest one, and the phantom duplicates are projected backwards. So you'll have events that happened in the Renaissance in Albania, and then it's projected backwards into Greek antiquity. But mathematically, he could see the charts side by side that these events mimicked each other. Right? It's the same basic format of events. It's the same sequence of events that happened over and over and over, 2, 3, 4 times. These are phantom duplicates, and this is part of the way that nations have filled out their history. It's part of the way that the Jesuits have written history. And so when we think about the Library of Alexandria, if it did exist, number one, it probably wasn't where they said it was. Probably wasn't where Alexandria in Egypt is now. Probably somewhere else in the world. And it probably happened as early as 300, 400 years ago. Definitely didn't happen 2,000 or more years ago, because we don't know anything that happened 2,000 years ago. And that sounds bleak. Like, what do you mean we don't know? No, we just don't know. We can't trust these people. We can't trust the information that they've given us. There's so many holes in it that it doesn't help us at all. It doesn't do us any favors to believe in deep antiquity. So, was it burned down? Probably. You know, was there storehouses of information? Probably. Was it owned by the old world civilization in some way? Probably. Right? So when the Romans basically won the grand war against the old world, Tartarians, if we can call it for short, just for simplicity, when they won against Tartaria, they put every effort into destroying their history. And let me say that there's a very specific example of this that we know happened. We know that there was a war in 1773 to 1775, which was probably the last major war with the Romans or the Europeans, you know, the Romans against the Tartars. And specifically, they called him the imposter czar, Pugachev, the imposter czar. This is supposedly the last czar of the old world, of the free world, of Tartaria, Great Tartaria, and the empire that he represented. We know that happened in 1773 to 1775. That's a recorded historical event. The very next year, America was founded, right, 1776. this Tartarian Empire did spread to it included the Americas as well. But the point here is that we know that after the Romanovs, is what they were called, by the way, the Russians who defeated Pugachev were called the Romanovs. Huge coincidence there, that's why I just call them the Romans. We know that they set out on a deliberate campaign to destroy all records of the war, all records of the Tartars, and all records of Pugachev. And we got a few rough pictures of him, paintings of him, and they're probably not even true. But they would, you know, it was punishable by death. People in Siberia, basically, which was the capital of Grand Tartary, they were threatened with death if they even talked about Pugachev. So that's just one example. We know that they erased history deliberately, and that definitely goes for Alexandria as well.
Right. Thank you, Ryan. Interesting. Okay. Then my next question then is, how old do you think the universe is? The Bible is saying, give or take, say 10,000 years. The Big Bang Theory is saying billions of years. Which do you think those are
I
two?
don't believe the Big Bang version. But the problem with the Bible is it's not very specific on this. It requires a lot of interpretation, and it's far back. Even if we believe that history stretches back 2,000 years, well, for 2,000 years, apparently, people have been arguing about this date. And this is one of the problems with dating things in history, by the way, because in old writings, people often reference the time that they're talking about in relation to the time of the Genesis. So this mattered a lot. If we don't know when Genesis was, then we don't know when this other event happened, because they didn't come up with dates until, again, the Renaissance, right? Mm-hmm. So before that, people would be like, oh, it's the 4th year into the reign of King so-and-so, you know, or it's 5 years after the Great Flood, stuff like this, right? Or, you know, 200 years after Genesis. You know, again, the problem is that some people took each day in Genesis, in the book Genesis, they took each day to mean 1,000 years. So this is partially how a lot of people got around the date of 6,000 years, that each day of creation equaled 1,000 years. And that's, it's tough to reconcile with other calculations, and these calculations vary just wildly. So there's no one human being that knows this, and there's no one that is a true authority on this, because everybody had different guesses of how long the events in Genesis took place, and therefore we don't know when they actually took place. We don't know how long a Genesis day was, then, or even if it happened, and we don't know when the original Genesis day started. We don't know what year 0 is. How old do I think it is? Man, it's hard to tell. Man, it's hard to tell. We can't trust radiocarbon dating or any isotope dating as well, because we don't have a way to calibrate those things. We can calibrate things. Say radiocarbon dating was invented 50 years ago. Well, we can accurately date things then within 50 years because we have these reference points. So if we created a new material and we isotope dated it to 10 years old because it was created 10 years ago, we know that because we have physical evidence to reference with our data to make sure our radiocarbon thing is correct. But when we're using radiocarbon to go 1,000, 2,000, 3,000 years back, it's pretty much a guess. And even the mainstream dating world, whether they're using radiocarbon or isotope or dendrochronology, the counting of tree rings, they only base their accuracy in reference to historical events that we know happened, right? So they'll say, oh, we've got this this type of artifact that we know came from ancient Egypt, from the 2nd dynasty, and so we know that the 2nd dynasty, I'm putting "know" in big quotes here, we know the 2nd dynasty was at this time, so we can believe that this artifact was here at this time, and therefore they're calibrating their carbon dating and their isotope dating to these points in history that were written by Jesuits in the Renaissance, right? So if we don't have a way to calibrate isotope dating, then isotope dating is useless. It doesn't tell us anything. So, and you get wildly different opinions on this too, right? Like they'll be like, oh, Göbekli Tepe or any of these old monuments. They'll be like, oh, this is millions of years old. You know, how the heck do you know this? There's no way that we can calibrate these things. And if you think about it too, like a rock, okay, so a rock is part of a monument or whatever, a building or whatever. If the rock is millions of years old, that doesn't tell us how old the building is. It doesn't
True.
tell us how old the civilization is. And that's even assuming we know the age of the rock, which I don't think we do. So I don't think we can know these things, frankly, unless there's some higher intelligence or some civilization that's been here longer and saw this stuff happen and can give us some sort of accurate starting point to be like, no, it was 10,000 years ago that this stuff happened. Right? Graham Hancock and many others, they point to this date of like 12,000 years ago, sort of after the Great Flood, and so that could be accurate. I guess there's a lot of correlation there throughout the world of this 12,000 year thing, but that also relies on so many other points of history that I'm pretty sure are completely false. So was it 12,000 years ago? Was it 4,000 years ago? Is it 20,000 years ago? I don't know. I don't think it's millions. If it was millions, I don't think we would have much way to know, because our stuff here on Earth doesn't seem to last that long. You know, part of this whole mudflood theory is that much of the world has been destroyed several times through major cataclysms, unfathomably large and violent cataclysms. So we don't have much left over from millions of years ago if there was civilizations millions of years ago. And this is it's a very difficult question for anybody to answer. Obviously I'm on the spot here trying to provide some clarity to it, but I think the point is that nobody knows. And unless there was somebody there, some civilization who's been watching over us, who can tell us, hey, this is actually what happened, roughly, then I don't think we're ever going to know.
All right, I pretty much agree with you, because even in the dating that we use in the Bible, what we actually do is we calculate per age. Abraham gave birth to, lived and so amount of time and gave birth to his children, Cain and Abel, then gave birth. So we're just plotting the age. So when we plot the age, we arrive at, give or take, about 6,000 plus. So this is just the calculation that we usually use. Anyway, and we are dating this to the time of Jesus, right? Which is what we're about to touch on right now. Okay, before we get to Mudflood, while I was reading Anatoly Fomenko's book, he mentioned the impact of Joseph Justus Scaliger, from where we get the Scaligerian chronology, and how much of our dating is related to this person, right? So what I'm trying to ask here before we go further is, did you think Jesus' time was 2,000 years ago?
No, definitely not. And Fomenko, I think he's a bit generous, and he thinks that we have documents that go back, I believe, to the 900s, 900 AD, maybe a little bit before that. But I guess I kind of have to believe him, but I don't see anything over 1,000 years that we can accurately say happened over 1,000 years ago. So with this whole, like, whatever civilizations were before that, Göbekli Tepe could have been 500 years ago for all we know. Again, the age of the rocks just doesn't say anything. So was Jesus 2,000 years ago? No, I definitely do not think so, because we have no evidence of anything 2,000 years ago at all. Fomenko believes he lived in the Renaissance. He believed he was a Slavic person in the Renaissance. And I haven't gotten to that book yet. I've read 4 of his books. I've read one other book on ancient Greece, Hidden Chronology of Ancient Greece. It's called Redating Ancient Greece by Sylvain Tristan. I very highly recommend that, by the way. It's very accessible. Fomenko is a little bit dense. But let me touch on this Newton thing. Because Isaac Newton had a problem with chronology as well. And he never meant to publish the book that he was working on in the last years of his life, called the Chronology of Ancient Kingdoms Amended. And his amendments were not as radical as Fomenko, but Newton is considered one of the greatest thinkers of all time. Whatever we think about him, he was a Mason and all this stuff, whatever. He was still a genius, it's in some way. And he had major problems with chronology. He had major problems with the way that these can't be accurate. he only used the text that he was given, right? He say, hey, history said this happened, but this guy was supposed to have hung out with this guy. Well, that couldn't have happened. So he's just finding all of these holes like Swiss cheese in the basic explanations of antiquity, basically. So Newton had a problem with it. Everybody basically said that Newton had lost his mind in his last years, and his book was published unfinished and against his will. He didn't want it to be. He was just sharing snippets with people, and they published it, and it annoyed him. His book is very hard to read, by the way. Flamenco is much better at it. But you mentioned Petavius. You mentioned Scaliger, Joseph Scaliger, and Petavius. These are Jesuit, again, Romans that basically are responsible for almost our entire written history. Those two men. There's a few others involved, but when we think of standard chronology or mainstream chronology or the sequence of events that we're given in the textbooks at school, this is Scaligerian chronology. It comes from him. And one of the giveaways of the problems with the entirety of his work, of Joseph Scaliger's work, is how accurate it was in the first time that they wrote it. When Scaliger and the other Jesuits got together and wrote our history, or early history books, they were very confident in their dates and times. They were like, this battle happened at exactly this place at exactly 3:30 in the afternoon, kind of thing, right? Whereas these people didn't have clocks. They didn't have clocks. The clocks is a recent invention. A lot of the history, they were using water clocks, or they were using literally candles. They'd burn one candle after another. Monks would measure time based on how many prayers they could say in that time. Like, this is highly, highly inaccurate stuff here. So to say that anything happened at 2 o'clock in the afternoon on March 3rd, 54 BC or something, it's just ridiculous. And modern historians know how ridiculous the accuracy was. And so now when you see those same events written about, they are usually just like the year or the month or the season. They're like, oh, this battle happened sometime in spring somewhere in Germany. They're much more modern in the sense of being humbler in understanding that we couldn't possibly have known the direct accuracy of many of the things that were claimed by Joseph Scaliger. But what I'm describing here is modern history basically making excuses for Scaliger and omitting his mistakes. But they're admitting that he made mistakes by omitting his accuracy, right? They leave out his accuracy because they know his accuracy was BS. How the heck do we know that he was correct or honest about the other things if we know that they just flat out made up the accuracy of many things, including Genesis, by the way, right? They wanted to, the Jesuits, the Scaliger and Petavius, they wanted to erase doubt, right? They wanted to give the people confidence in their version of history, and part of the way that they thought that would give people confidence in it is by being accurate, by saying, no, this happened exactly this time in exactly this place with exactly these people. Don't worry about it. We got to figure it out. But again, modern historians recognize that's most definitely not the case. We do not know the accuracy. It's downright silly to even believe that we could have accuracy in times where we didn't have clocks. And the average person definitely didn't have a clock. We had sundials, and again, people until the Renaissance were largely using their own dating references. Again, 5 years into the reign of this king and 3 years after this great fire happened and stuff like that. They're using very close temporal time references to write about the things that they were experiencing in their own time. So you wouldn't have people in Poland saying, oh yeah, it's the year 1360, at the same time when people in Japan are saying, oh yeah, no, don't we agree, it's 1360. No, right? They were using reference dates to things that happened near them physically and near them in time, right? People in Japan would be referencing, it'd be like, okay, this happened last Tuesday, 5 years after this other event. So it's a very difficult task to put all this stuff together, and especially when you consider there are cultures like China, which was part of Tartaria, you know, the Chinese Tartary, well, they didn't accept the Genesis date at all, at all. They didn't use that dating reference at all. So, you know, their time periods are always based on this dynasty. You know, we're 5 years into this dynasty. That's when this happened. You know, they never said since the time of Jesus. They never said that in the modern dating systems that we use, Gregorian calendars and all this. They never use those datings. We only give them those datings now in modern history, and starting with Scaligerian.
All right. Thank you so much. I would be dead if I don't touch on Mudflood because I have people on my neck already. So Mudflood, like I said, the first time I took it a little bit seriously was after watching your lecture, and you did a video where you were going to different buildings to, you know, show evidences of mud flood in Canada. My question is this mud flood a global thing? That is the first question. Is it globally? Second question is, did this mud flood happen in different times? Okay, because I want you to be able to cover everything. Is it a global flood? Did it happen in different time? Third question then is, when was the last time there was a mud flood? And finally, looking into some of the maps, there are maps that depicted California to be some sort of island. In some time in history, California was an island, according to some of the maps. And these maps are coming from reliable, or should I say that they want us to think these maps are reliable. And these are maps from different people, not just from one particular individual. These are maps that are, you know, correlated by some other, okay. One then asking then is, one, was the mud flood a global thing? Did it happen in different time, or is it a one-time event? Okay. The third question then is, when was the last mud flood? Okay. And finally, why did we have maps depicting California as an island before what it is today? Go ahead.
All right. All right. Okay. First of all, I have been making videos on Mudflood for almost 4 years now. And I do encourage people to watch those videos.
I would send it.
Especially the California one, because I think Fomenko has a very satisfying explanation for that. But I'll go a little bit deeper into it right now. So I think we should separate out mud flood from the great flood, from the biblical flood.
Oh, yeah.
I don't know the accuracy of the Bible, but I believe there is a lot of truth in it. And when it comes to the Great Flood, I believe there is a lot of evidence for a Great Flood, which is a water flood. It's not a mud flood, a water flood. The Great Flood, I do not believe, is the same as the mud flood, not at all. This is a different historical event. And we can kind of tie these things together a little bit. Let's see the California island thing. On old maps, California was depicted on an island, as an island. I think that they were using legends from the past. I think that they knew that at one point it was an island. Now, Fomenko's explanation, which I agree with, and Uriah and I disagreed on this a little bit in our talk, but it actually opened up something very interesting, which I'll get to as well. So it was depicted as an island, but all of the surrounding territories, especially the northwest of America and Canada, was literally called parts unknown. It was a total blank spot. So we had the Americas mapped out very, very well in the 15th, 16th, 17th century, 18th century. We had it mapped out pretty well. The whole east seaboard, we had all the towns there. Mexico, we had all the cities there. We knew what was going on. But for some reason, we had this big, huge blank spot around the northwest, parts unknown. Now, Fomenko believes that these were Tartary lands. These were old world lands. And the Romanovs, the Romans, the Europeans, Catholics, were not allowed there. Now, the reason I do believe this is because Alaska was Russian, number one. Number two, someone asked here, who do you think was the original people in the Americas? I can't really say that. But what they tell us is that it was Mongoloid people that were there. Now, Mongol is a very It's an old word, but only recently has Mongol come to mean a Mongolian, someone from Mongolia. Mongolia didn't didn't gain independence from China until like recently, like less than 100 years ago, I believe. So Mongolia is a country and as a nation and as a cultural people is a very new invention. We've just given them that name. Mongol means the great. So when you talk about the Mongolian Empire, you just mean the Great Empire, which some people are calling the Tartarian Empire, but a Tartarian is a warrior. So a Tartar, or Tatar, they would be warriors in the Great Empire, right? And there's other words for this as well. A Cossack is also just a soldier, and so they've jumbled all these things up. And by the way, a Khan and a Tsar and a Caliph are all the same meaning as well. Great leader, right? So a Khan or a Tsar or a Caliph, California, land of the Caliphs. These were great leaders in the Mongolian, which is the Great Empire.
Ah, yes.
So a Tsar or a Khan is a leader in the Great Empire, and a Tartar is a soldier in the Great Empire. So keep all that in mind. So in California, the name kind of gives it away. The land of the Tsars, the land of the kings, the land of the caliphs. What kings? Kings as part of the Mongolian Empire. The Mongolian Empire was the old world, which was opposed to the Roman world. They were enemies, always been enemies. They didn't like the Catholics. They were at war with them, always. They didn't let them into their territory. So there was inaccuracies because the maps that we have are mostly from the Romans. They're from the Catholics, right? The Europeans. These are the ones who gave us the maps that we're looking at, including the ones that show California as an island. There's massive inaccuracies with Tartar territories, including Siberia, Japan, and the northwest part of the Americas. So I do believe that the Europeans conquered the east part of America first, which is why it was mapped so accurately, so much more accurately. There's very, very few mistakes, at least not glaring mistakes such as California is an island. Again, I do believe that it was an island at one point, but not in the 17th century, not in the 1700s. You're right, 18th century, but not even 1500s. Whenever they first found it, no, I don't believe it was an island at that point. But I believe that their legends, they knew the truth. They knew the truth that there was an Atlantis and California was an island at some point. But since they weren't allowed there, they had to just guess, and they figured it was still an island, I guess, because they were able to go through the Baja part of California, right? California goes down. It's a peninsula now, and it goes down, but the very bottom part of it is part of Mexico. It's called Baja California. So Mexico is all mapped very accurately. I believe they conquered Mexico. They did. And they were able to go up through Baja, and it probably looked like an island at that point, and they had legends. The whole world probably had legends that California was an island at some point, big island. So they just drew it as an island. Now, they say that Mongoloid people were the first people. They were the Indians of North America. Well, who are the Mongols? Again, they're Asians, and Asia was the heart of the Tartarian Empire, right? Tartary, Grand Tartary, Chinese Tartary. So these were what we would call today Mongoloid people. So, having said all of that, there probably was an island. It probably was an island at some point because there probably was a great flood. Don't know how far back it was. Now, in the talk with Uriah, I blew my mind up there because I remembered, like I forgot, but I connected the fact that in Utah, we have on top of a mountain, this is where we get our minerals from that we sell as supplements, our plant-derived minerals. It's in a deposit in Utah. And we know it was under the sea. Like we were talking about lakes. Uriah and I were talking about lakes, and we're talking about Lake Titicaca, and Lake Titicaca is still a blue zone. It's got all the nutrients there that you need. And, maybe they dammed up and drained these lakes in order to suppress humanity or something like that. But I didn't mention the scale of the deposit that we have in Utah. The scale is massive. Our company owns 100 cubic miles. 100 cubic miles I remember it's a huge number, 100 cubic miles of plant material that was in the sea. We know it was in the sea. We know it was in the sea because it has a limestone cap on top of it that's full of seashells. And that's how it has all the minerals in it, because as we talked in the nutrient talk, all the minerals are in seawater. So plants that grow in the seawater are going to have a concentration of all the minerals in it. And we know from chemical analysis, obviously, that it has all the minerals in it, but that's the answer of the explanation why this particular deposit has all the minerals in it, because it was a sea forest. And we don't know how old it is. You know, even our company will say it's millions of years old or it's ancient. I don't know. But it was not a lake, is my point here. That's not a lake. It's a sea. Maybe it's a inland sea. Maybe it was part of a bigger sea, hence the California as an island. So it could easily have been an island, because Utah doesn't border California directly, but it's in that vicinity still. So if our deposit in Utah is representative of the type of terrain that was there at some point, then that means Utah was in the middle of a sea. So yes, California could easily have been an island at some point. I do not believe it was an island when Europeans first got there. I believe when Europeans first got there, they didn't have access to those lands because Tartaria still existed in those lands. And we mentioned that 1773 to 1775 was the final war, the defeat of the impostor czar. That's what the Romans who wrote history now call him. They call him an impostor, but probably it's the opposite, like everything they tell us. Is probably that he was the last true czar. He wasn't an imposter. And everybody after him was an imposter czar. You know, they tried to take over these titles and these kingdoms and so on. But they defeated him in 1775. And the very next year, 1776, America proclaims its independence. It's a huge, huge coincidence there, if you ask me. But we still didn't conquer the West until way after that. It was all the way up until 1850 that they were supposedly founding San Francisco and Salt Lake City and stuff like this. So we didn't make our way west until way later. It took a while. Why? Probably because there were still Tartars there as part of a resistance. And that probably included California as well. So keep all that in mind. Probably was a great flood, and it's separate from the Mudflood. Was the Mudflood a global thing? No, I think the Great Flood was, but the Mudflood, it's easier to parse apart in America, because it's easier to tell lies from truth in America, because America has a more recent history. Like telling how old something is in Europe is quite a bit more difficult, because there's very few places in Europe that were founded in 1850 according to the mainstream history, right? Most of European cities and stuff, they're many hundreds of years old, so it's very hard to check these facts. But we know that it's inaccurate what they tell us in America, because in 1850, San Francisco was already built up, and Salt Lake City was already built up and stuff. So it's a very good evidence for that. But I don't think there's enough evidence to say that it happened everywhere all at once. I don't think so. I think there were major cataclysms, probably around the time that our history begins. This is somewhere around year 1000. There's lots of disagreements on this. Cataclysms in the 1300s, basically around the times of the Great Plague, that it probably wasn't a germ plague, because people who wrote about that time, they write about fire from the sky and huge lightning storms and all kinds of very, very dramatic things that point to a massive cataclysm much more than an actual plague. So those were probably part of the Mudflood. Now, forgive me for people who are just new to this Mudflood thing. Mudflood basically is just the proof that we have is that a lot of our infrastructure is buried in mud, and it doesn't make sense. Nobody would build a 12-foot first story of a building with a grand entrance and windows and then bury it. It never made sense. It doesn't make sense. So you can look into YouTube is a great resource for that. I've got some videos on that, but there's lots of videos showing lots of things being buried, our past being literally buried in mud. We dug out New York City. A lot of these places, we dug out train tracks. We didn't lay the train tracks. we did lay some train tracks, but I'm pretty sure that technology is from the past because we've uncovered a lot of it. We've literally unburied some of it, unburied tunnels. We've unburied reservoirs and viaducts and all this stuff that was buried. You know, sometimes it's only a few feet, and sometimes it's like 30 feet, 60 feet. In a lot of cases, we don't even know how deep the layer goes. You know, mainstream history calls this a cultural layer, by the way, as if it's like people were just so dirty that we just let dirt build up till it covered houses and stuff. Like, just stop it. It's silly. It's silly. It's a very fun topic, this mud flood thing, because they must have thought we were really, really stupid when they started writing this stuff. And it's hard to backtrack now. They're like, no, we built this Parliament, built it in 2 years. Don't worry about it. Don't worry about it. And you're looking at it now and you're like, come on, guys. This is just silly. You know, then if you can look at old pictures too, it's a great way to find out that this is just BS. But yeah, I don't think it happened all at once. And let's go back to this huge cataclysm, because mud flood is a layer of mud. Obviously, it is what it's named. But there are much more serious examples of massive cataclysm, melted buildings. You know, things that look like mountains now, but you can see the windows and you know. Inside caves, there were bricks on the inside. These look like they were massive electrical storms that literally melted massive buildings. So part of my theory, I'm not sure if this is the case of what actually happened, but I think that the main events are these massive electrical storms from the sky, from the gods maybe. I don't know, but they were huge. And I think the areas that were destroyed were far more impressive than the areas that we have left over. The areas we have left over that were covered in mud were not destroyed by electrical storms. You know, of course, they're there. They weren't destroyed. I think those are downstream, downhill. I think that the electrical storms that literally vaporized huge portions of the world, including much of the northwest of America, including much of Central Asia, especially Mongolia and Kazakhstan and Tajikistan. These places, they look like they've been completely destroyed, melted from above. And so I'm imagining that what we call mud flood in the places that were left over, that mud probably came from those cataclysms, those larger cataclysms, if that makes sense. I don't think it's all downhill. Now, some of the videos that I made, most of the videos that I made where I was just walking around looking at buildings, were in southern Ontario, Canada. Southern Ontario is very much downhill. Even though as you go far north, like now I live way far up north in Ontario. It's not that high up in sea level though. Like, you know, I'm 6 hours north, direct due north, highway speed driving 6 hours from Toronto. It's not like it's high elevation the whole time though. Or only like, I think it's like 100 feet elevation at that point. But there's basically nothing up there. There's no mud flood stuff that I know of up there. But what is up there is more destroyed evidence of things like star forts and stuff. So we know that actually I kind of want to put no in quotes there, but no, man, if there's star forts up in Hudson Bay, then there's an advanced civilization up in Hudson Bay, period. It's not even a quote. Like, no, we know that there is an advanced civilization up there. So I think that most of the destruction happened upstream, so to speak, right? Even though it's not that high elevation up there, it's high enough. So if the massive destruction happened up there in the north, then whatever was down of that, Ottawa, Toronto, those other towns that I filmed, those are all downhill from that. Well, it's there, mud. It's mud flood, right? So the cataclysm didn't happen downstream, it happened upstream. And the mud maybe rolled down from that. Maybe it was just part of the earth, the shock to the earth that created that. Now, I'm going to stop, but let me mention one thing. A lot of people have this theory that what created the mud flood is something called liquefaction. It's basically when the earth is shaked violently enough, the solid dirt turns to liquid. Now, the reason I don't like that as an explanation for mudflood is because if it was purely an effect of liquefaction, we wouldn't really have buildings left over because it's such violence, right? And people use little experiments in like a fish tank, and they'll put a little building there, but the building is usually a model made of one piece, right? And they'll put it on dirt and they'll shake the dirt and it turns to liquid, and they're like, hey, look, the house shrinks now, it sinks into the mud. Yeah, but if we're talking about a brick building, if we're talking about a brick building, that shaking would destroy the brick building. Like, what are we talking about here, right? In a couple of my videos, they don't show up very well on video, but I could literally see that the mud had to have come from uphill somewhere, because the mud literally pushed the building. And when I'm looking at the building, the back of the building has a bow to it, a bow to it. So you can see that the pressure of the mud came from a direction. Maybe the liquefaction happened upstream, but it didn't happen directly around that building. These buildings are, like, they're nice, but they're not that nice, They're not going to hold up to, you couldn't do that to your house, And I don't care how strong the building is. I mean, I think you do that to the pyramid's going to fall apart. So I think that if liquefaction is any part of the explanation, it happened upstream. Didn't happen directly around it. And the first video that I ever made on mudflood was in Ajax, Ontario. And I think it's my most watched video on my personal YouTube channel, The Real Notice, actually. But that's where I could see most clearly, you see it with my own eyes, like, hey, this looks like it's a stream of mud, and you can't see in the video, but I know the way that I'm oriented there, that the lake is down, right? So all this buckling that I'm talking about, the lake is this way, and the buckling is this way. So the mud came from this direction. There's no doubt about that. It didn't fall from the sky. And that doesn't make sense anyway. Some people think the mud fell from the sky. It just doesn't. No. It came from somewhere. And it probably came from uphill. And that means to me that the major destruction was uphill. And some people think that this was a targeted cataclysm, like somehow humans did this, or that it was part of a war or something. Maybe, I don't know. If they had that technology then, I don't know why they don't still use it, these controllers. I mean, that's pretty amazing. I don't think they would have to lie about nuclear weapons and stuff. Whole nother topic, but I don't think they would have to lie about the power that they claim to have now if they truly had the power to destroy whole cities and civilizations with force from the sky. I think they would just keep holding that above us. They'd be like, hey, you peasants better stay in line, or we'll freaking melt your whole country. So I think it was a natural occurrence of somehow from the earth itself, or from the gods. I don't know, but I don't think it was from humans. And I think it happened upstream. And I think the cataclysms, again, uphill or whatever, those are what caused what we see as the mud floods now. And this would be true again in the San Francisco. San Francisco, again, is a good example because it's said to be a very new place. 1850s showed up, and it's supposed to be a mining town. But I live in a mining town, Kirkland Lake, Ontario. I promise, a mining town does not have cathedrals in it and all this grand old world architecture. But my point is that most of the places that survived are by the sea or are downhill. And the major cataclysms seem to be uphill from that. So we were just talking about the Utah area, and the Utah, Nevada, Wyoming, a lot of this place just seems to be totally melted. Massive cataclysms. But what's downhill from that? San Francisco, right? Salt Lake. In the other direction, Chicago, and cities that survive still. Last thought on this: there are some places that are high elevation that have survived, and that's fine. We're not saying that the entire world was destroyed all at once. I believe the most accurate theory is that these cataclysms were very, very extreme, but they did not destroy everything in the totality. Certain areas of the world were hit harder than others. The northwest of America is one of them, and the central part of Asia is another one.
All right, Ryan. Like I said from the beginning of the discussion, getting into this thing with Mudflood and chronology is not something that we could finish in a day. So I'm looking at running like a series because uh, we've really spent some time. We've been here for like an hour, 15 minutes, and what I'm going to do is just do maybe another 15 minutes where we get to answer some questions very briefly, and then we touch on another angle to this Mudflood and chronology discussion. By the way, I don't. Do you agree, Uriah? And I saw this when I read the book from. There was this book I read, "When the Rocks Cry Out" by Horace Butler, and then the proposition or what they were saying is that what the author said was that Egypt, as we know it in Africa today, is not the real deal. Is not the original Egypt, and I think this is the same position that Uriah is holding. Matter of fact, when from the book When the Rocks Cry Out, Horace was saying that some of the temples mentioned in the Bible were located in the Americas, places like Peru, Mexico. And that reminds me of some of the things that were discovered in the Grand Canyon, some ancient Egypt shrines and gods and whatnot in the Grand Canyon. So do you think the Egypt as we have it today was not, or is not, sorry, the real deal?
Well, that's one of the things that Uriah first brought to my attention too, and that first got me into this. Let me just say, put Egypt aside for 1 second. I wrote it down. Rome, most certainly was not Rome, Italy. Rome, Italy is a new thing. Rome was very probably, for most of history, multiple places. It probably just meant the capital. And for the most part, the Roman capital was Istanbul, Constantinople, city of the kings, right? So names are reused all over the place. And this is part of Anatoly Fomenko's phantom history. Names are duplicated all over the place. And maybe that's a way to obfuscate the truth as well, because Rome shows up all throughout history. We never really know which Rome they're referring to. Are they referring to St. Petersburg, Russia, which would also have been called Rome at certain periods of time? What about New York? New York was New Rome, right? So was it originally just called Rome at some point? Were some texts talking about New York when they're talking about Rome? It's going to be the same with Egypt. And, Uriah's got this big thing about a big, long documentary series of America is Egypt.
Egypt, yeah.
I think the answer is probably yes and no. The answer is there's probably multiple Egypts. Egypt was probably a word that did not designate one single place. It probably designated a type of place, if that makes sense. Now, one of the interesting things that he brought to my attention, and we talked on our podcast there a couple weeks ago, but it's hard to talk about it without showing it, because the Egypt that we all know in our minds seems to be a very recent invention. And I say invention because old pictures don't look like that. Like, wouldn't you not think that the first pictures of the Great Pyramids would look like the Great Pyramid? They don't. And he was saying that they're, again, in words, he was saying that they're pointy. And we did this talk on audio, so I couldn't give the hand gestures here. But it's true that the way that people drew the pyramids, especially before photography, they drew them as like very sharp pointed steeples almost. They didn't look anything like the pyramids that we know today. And artists were not stupid. They were very good at depicting what they saw. And according to the version of history that we get, they didn't have much else to do. So that they had every reason and ability to sit there and draw things accurately. Why wouldn't they draw a pyramid in the pyramid shape that we know when it looked, why would they draw it like this when it looked like this today? How would it change that much? How would the Sphinx change that much? How would the layout of pyramids change so much? So we tend to think of these things as ancient, but I really don't believe it. Stonehenge is a better example because they tell us that Stonehenge is super old. But we know that Stonehenge was built recently. There is footage of it. We filmed it. It's built. Oh, we restored it. What the heck do you need to restore rocks for? What are you talking about? Right? It does not make any sense. These are stones. You have to restore stones? Why wouldn't you? And even if they were toppled over, why wouldn't you just put them back in place? That's not what they did. They made rebar and concrete replicas, supposedly replicas, of the stones that were there, and they put them into place with modern machinery. Why would they have to do that? Right? So they, in my opinion, they built Stonehenge recently as a tourist attraction. And I think Uriah believes this. I'm not sure. These are old videos of his that I'm not even sure are still up. But
Yeah.
I think he was making the point that Egypt, like Cairo, Egypt, is basically a theme park. It was built to attract us and to distract us.
Sure.
It was built to give us a picture of history that didn't exist. And that could be because Egypt, as they mention it in old texts, really did happen in America. That's a very real possibility. But for whatever reason, the depiction of Egypt has changed significantly, and it absolutely should not have changed significantly. Now, last thought on this. There are pyramids all throughout the Americas, but people think that this mostly has to do with Mexico and South America. It's not true at all. There's pyramids all over the place. And in one of the videos that I made, it's called the Canada Countryside Mudflood. It's not the greatest evidence, I admit, from the video that I made and from the pictures that I shared. But when I first found this thing that I thought looked a bit weird, it's a power station. It's in the countryside, just north of Toronto, and I thought it looked weird. It was a mound that was built sort of in a pyramid shape, but it had an old red brick Mudflood building built into the hill, and I thought that's just very weird. And for an electric, I know I'm going a little bit long here. I know we're going to wrap this up, but this is one of the most interesting things I ever found, actually. And it speaks to the fact that the ancient world, particularly in the way that we view Egypt, could easily have been in America and Canada. So I saw this building, and I'm like, this building's freaking weird. And I was with my mom at the time. She's helping me film. We're filming the Mudflood stuff. And we're just parked out front of it looking at it. And like, not only does this building look really weird, and not only does it look like it's built into a pyramid with, its grassy slopes, but it looks like a pyramid. But there's really high security around this building. There's like quite a lot of cameras and, transmitters for these cameras and stuff. And like, why do there need to be all this security? There's nobody here. Why do there need to be all this security for this weird building? Didn't make sense to me. I went to look on Google Earth at that time when I got home that day. This was years ago, 4 years ago, 3 years ago, I don't know. Went to go look on Google Earth, and it looked exactly like a pyramid. And I'm like, wow, it blew my mind. For some reason, I didn't take a screenshot at that time. When I went back, maybe it was a few days later, maybe it was a few months later, I cannot remember. When I went back to Google Earth, the picture had changed. And it makes me sound like a conspiracy theorist, and like, I don't think anybody's literally watching these things, but maybe it was just a coincidence. But the picture had changed, and it was no longer completely clear. That's why I said the video that I made, it's not completely clear that it's a pyramid, but I promise the first picture that I looked at blew my mind open, because I'm here in Toronto and I'm looking at a pyramid, right? It's actually in Pickering, North Pickering, just east of Toronto. Blew my mind. What is a pyramid doing here? This makes no sense at all. Even the natives and whatever, they did not build pyramids. So we're told. Not in Canada. There's no pyramids in Canada, supposedly, but I found a pyramid. I'm still convinced that it's a pyramid. It still looks like one from the outside. It still looks like one from Google Earth, even though the Google Earth image has changed significantly. There's one more interesting point here. It's a power station, and it runs on a high voltage power line. This high voltage power line runs from Toronto, or maybe it even runs further, but I think it just runs from Toronto. So I'm near the start of it, and it runs all the way up to Ottawa. And on the other side of Ottawa's the capital of Canada, lots of mudflood buildings there and so on, star forts and so on, lots of old world infrastructure in Ottawa. It's one of the most northern places in Canada that I can say for sure is old world infrastructure, because up where I live, I told you, there ain't no infrastructure up there other than the remnants of star forts. There's no mudflood buildings in my town at all. There's no mud flood buildings for many hundreds of miles in every direction, as far as I can tell, except for Ottawa. Ottawa is about 6 hours away from me in the other direction. But the point is, this is a huge straight line that is now a high voltage power line. And right across the river from Ottawa, the Ottawa River, is a city called Gatineau. Gatineau. It's Quebec. It's on the Quebec side. This is the border of Ontario and Quebec. Quebec's French. So there's Ottawa and there's Gatineau. This line is called the Gatineau line. And I did a lot of research on this town, Pickering, Ajax. I went to the library. I got all the old history books because I grew up in these towns. Right? I grew up in East Toronto, Pickering, Ajax. I lived in all these places. And so I not only had the cultural references very well established in my head, and that's why I did the Mudflood videos there, because I was very familiar with these places. I knew what were the oldest buildings in town and so on. And I knew that I could actually get access to a lot of the historical documents just by going to the library and renting them. And I did. And I even actually sat down with the historian of Pickering in the library. They worked in the library, and I got to pick their brain just a little bit. You know, they didn't know anything about this, but one of the things that I couldn't get to the bottom of was, how old is this Gatineau line? Now, I'm saying that this is because this is a power line, right? Okay, it's a high voltage power line. Well, to have a high voltage power line, you have to own the land. So the government had to own this land for a long time because there's never been any development on it at all. There's a pyramid on it, remember, on this line, directly on this line. Now, there's a lot of these mudflood theorists and hidden history theorists who talk about the idea of the fact that we used to be able to capture electricity and energy from the atmosphere and harness it ourselves. Now, this matters if you think about it, because this line is now used to transport electricity, right? It's now used to transport electricity. I believe it always was used to transport electricity, because this line has existed as far back as any map that I can find, as far back in the history of these towns and stuff that I can find. This Gatineau line always existed. This Gatineau line existed before we had electricity, right? The first major electric generating plant was in Niagara Falls. This line was on maps before that. Did they plan to have electricity before that and just like, oh no, we got to keep this line, the government's got to keep this line, we got to make sure nobody ever develops anything on this line?
Bad network. Are we back?
We got frozen.
Yeah, I have problems with my network today. Okay, let's get back to it, and then I think that was a sign that we were done already. So just wrap it up for us, and then I'll see if we can take one question before we end it for tonight. Go ahead.
Well, we covered a lot here, and it's very hard to cover mudflood in sequence, because you can start with the history that they give us more close to us, and we can find the holes in that. We can look further back in history and find the holes in that. And I think you got the right idea that we should just kind of do it episode by episode and see what questions come up and see if we can fill in the gaps. Because yeah, we've covered so much today. It raises so many questions. If you never heard any of this stuff before, I understand it can be mind blowing, and we just get more and more questions the deeper that we go. Better questions, though.
Right. I think that should do. We've been here for an hour 30 minutes. It's been interesting. There's so much to discuss when it comes to mudflood. I have questions. We're supposed to touch on a whole lot of things. We're supposed to touch on the last time the mudflood happened. What is it? What is your take on Atlantis? But all of this we will deal with in our next discussion. Before we round it off, I'll see if we will take a question. Let me take a question. If you have a question, make it very brief. Just one question before we call it a night, because the network is crazy already. So I'm bringing on someone who asks question. Okay, hi Ryan, how are you doing?
Hi, how you doing? Hi, Ryan.
Hey.
Just one question only.
Okay. Oh, I had two questions, and I really stayed up for this. I was just really I wanted to know something. Okay, so the first one is the humanity that was existing before this last reset. I've been following the mud flood. Nobody has been able to tell me what happened between is it between 1811 going backwards to when the Renaissance or the Dark Age, you know, because apparently I found out that 1,000 years was added to our history. So that's the first question. Then the second question, why is it in Africa we don't have so much of this? I'm not saying the entire Africa, but mostly like Africa, we don't have a lot of these buildings, this energy harnessing buildings with domes, with star forts, with the tunnels and all that, you know, and the evidence of the mud flood. It appears that Africa seems to be exempted from this whole thing. So there's so much questions, but let's just stick to just these two. Maybe in future we can ask more questions.
Okay, I can give
Okay.
rapid answers to this if I'm allowed to.
Yes,
Okay.
just make it just very brief.
Humanity before the mud flood. Humanity
can
before the mud flood. I'm not 100% sure. I think
Okay.
there was a more of a mix of humans and humanoids back then. I think there were giants back then as well.
Yeah.
I think the giants were a big part of what we call the old world. That's one thing. The added 1,000 years, yes, that's. It seems like a simplification, but honestly, I believe it. You know, we didn't write dates with like 1530 1530.
Yeah.
It was an I or it was a J.
Yeah.
So it's probably just literally an added 1,000 years. Yes, I agree with that, and especially because even Flamenco says we don't really have any history going back over 1,000 years. So it's very likely that year one was roughly 1,000 years ago. You mentioned the year 1811. Well, when I made this video, who the heck built the red brick buildings on YouTube, and I was looking in art for evidence of when the red brick buildings were built, because it goes back further than photography. I hit a wall at 1780, around 1780. Prior to 1780, in 1780, paintings that I believe were painted in 1780, they already showed mud flood buildings. So I was confident at that point, but I hit a wall. I couldn't go any further. I was confident that in 1780, there was mud flood buildings. They were already built. They were already flooded, period. So that was, remember, this is right after America was founded in 1776, which was right after the defeat of the last imposter czar, Pugachev. So I don't really know what happened before that, but there's probably just outright missing chunks of history at this point, because we know that infrastructure was already built and so on. But when you go back any further, I really don't see evidence of that. Very quickly, we start to go right back into the Renaissance, which only depicts Renaissance buildings, Greco-Roman buildings. It doesn't show red brick buildings. So I'm looking to make a part 2 of that video and follow up on that. I don't really know. Let's talk about Africa.
Right.
Africa does have red brick buildings, but they're not the same. They're not as common as they are in Europe or America or Australia. Europe, if anything, seems to be almost untouched, right? It doesn't seem to have suffered the major cataclysm. At the very most, the major cataclysm seemed to be in the eastern part of Europe, even in Italy and stuff like that. But when we're talking about Central Europe, it's very much intact. The red brick infrastructure, the mud flood infrastructure is very much intact. And it is mud flooded, but it didn't suffer the same cataclysms as it did in other parts of the world. Now, there is red brick buildings in Kenya, at least, in Tanzania, more on the east side, and again, closer to the coast, downstream. So was there major cataclysms in Africa? Probably in the central part. And remember, the central part of Africa is also forest. I also live in an ocean of trees up in northern Ontario. It's an absolute ocean of trees. I mentioned that I just found a pyramid in southern Ontario. Well, you can't really see what's under the forest in northern Ontario. They say it's all the Canadian Shield. It's all one big rock, but I don't know. I'm now, every time I'm driving, I'm always looking at the hills, and I'm like, because they're covered in trees, but I'm like, does that look like a pyramid shape? It could. So there could be tons of stuff under Africa that's just buried. We don't know. There's lots of old infrastructure in Africa, obviously. there's lots of megalithic infrastructure in Africa. I've only actually been to North Africa, by the way. I've only been to Morocco in Africa, which is not what people think about when they think about Africa at all. But there's definitely, old world, like amazingly impressive architecture there for sure. Like he was saying, it doesn't have the domes and the arches and all that stuff, but it's still old world buildings for sure. So there was old world civilizations in Africa, no doubt. And I'll wrap this up. There's one of my favorite YouTubers, John Levi, Jonlevi, John Levi. Years ago, he made this video going through Google Earth, looking at Africa, and he was showing all these completely circular cutouts, like basically like cookie cutters, where there's lakes, and then it looks like circular pieces of land have been cut out and just like put in the lake, and like it looks very manufactured, but on a grand scale. Very, very, very impressive. There are plenty of star forts in Africa. This is why I like to separate out the major cataclysms from the Mudflood, and the Tartarian infrastructure that we talk about. These people probably built that world after the major cataclysm, right? That the red brick buildings, to my knowledge, don't go back to the 1300s and so on. It seems to be whoever survived the major cataclysm, part of the survivors, they built the red brick world. They used their skills to build the red brick world. The people before that probably built all the star forts and the megaliths and stuff like that. So we're talking about different civilizations, and probably most of the star fort builders, most of them probably were wiped out during these major cataclysms, and whoever was left used whatever knowledge was left to build less impressive yet still very impressive infrastructure in the form of the red brick buildings. Did they do it in Africa? Yes, they did do it in Africa, just not all over Africa. South Africa, again, is another place where it has plenty of this red brick infrastructure, and it's hidden. There's parts of Nairobi that are definitely showing it, but yeah, it's not everywhere in the world. Just like in Mongolia, you don't see red brick buildings in Mongolia, as far as I know. You do see them in China, where? Close to the coast, right? The areas that probably survived the most are probably close to the coast. And the areas that experienced the most damage were probably the inland mainlands, including the center of Africa and including the center of Asia as well.
Okay, Ryan, thank you so much. I think that will be it. Someone was asking, I think this should be a brief question, if Maryland and Delaware were a part of the Tatar territories.
All of America probably was, because the red brick infrastructure it's on the East Coast, it's on the West Coast, it's in Canada, it's in Alaska even, so the Tartars are probably all over the world, and the Roman expansion just took them out piece by piece. And again, I think the East Coast was just conquered before the West Coast. So yeah, it probably was Tartarian.
All right. Okay, everybody, thank you so much for joining Ryan. This has been very amazing. Like I said, we're going to have to run series on this one, right? It is not something that we can cover. I have tons of questions that we need to, touch on. Hopefully in our next discussion, in our next sit down, Ryan, hopefully we get to cover more topic, even giants. Giants is something that is not heavily spoken about. I think part of why we don't discuss mudflood in Africa is because not much effort has been put into studying Africa outside of what we're taught in school. Okay, but this is not something I've heard Africans speak on. And like you clearly said, one of the ways they get us distracted is by propping up something and then getting us to focus on that thing without thinking. Because when you look at the pyramid, the way Africans reason is that, oh, the pyramid is so mighty, and this is a testament to the fact that we did something so huge, so mighty in the past, therefore there's no need to question it.
And it's a good thing, right? So I said, even if your history is good, you still want to question it. But people might not want to question it. They might be like, no, that's our history. We want that to be our history, right?
Exactly. So, all right, guys. Thank you guys for joining. Ryan, it's been amazing again. Thank you so much for your time. I think we would be rounding it up right now. Please follow Ryan, support the platform as well. Hopefully, we'll bring you more discussion and more content. Thank you very much, Ryan. Any final word before I let you go?
Honestly, that's it. I appreciate you, Kelly. I appreciate everybody else, and I'm looking forward to the next one.
All right, thank you. Take care, everybody, and thank you for joining. Shalom.
I'm very excited to announce my newest book, Everything the Government Does is Bad for Us. And you can get the paperback on Amazon for just $9.99, and you can find the video read-along version or the audiobook on my website, noticebooks.org. And definitely check out my book, Fake Diseases. It covers all of the major topics that come up, like birth defects, blood sugar problems, bone and joint problems, cancer, autoimmune problems, and more. And it's on Amazon for just $9.99. And all of my books, audiobooks, and links are available on my website, noticebooks.org. And if you want to see what is apparently my most controversial video that was banned from YouTube and BitChute, you can go to wagthedogtheory.com and view the whole uncensored version of the video. And I recommend downloading it if it is still there. And if you didn't know, I have a whole bunch of merchandise that I designed myself, clothing, prints on canvases and on paper, as well as original artworks on my website, noticeart.com. And you can see more of my art on YouTube, the channel is Notice Art, or Instagram at The Real Notice. And make sure to check out my channel for many other videos on a whole array of subjects, and my other channels are all in the description of this video.